So I want to begin today by just talking in very general terms about some of the ideas that play a role in understanding the phenomenon of a quantum phase transition. And then towards the end of the lecture, I'll probably set up some formalism which is useful to do sort of simple calculations later in this course. But at the beginning, at least, I'm just going to try and sketch some ideas. Uh, and the hope is towards the end of this course of lectures, you will have seen at least one example of each of these ideas at work in a concrete, simple calculation. So let's start right at the beginning uh, and remind ourselves that when we first learned physics, we learned Newton's laws or equivalently Hamiltonian mechanics. And this is a complete looking theory. You have coordinates q, momenta p, and you write there's some energy function which is a function of p's and q's. These are all things you know, but let me just write them down once. You say that the coordinates change with the rate of change given by this, and the momenta change and this is supposed to be a complete description even of a very large collection of atoms or molecules that make up a gas. In principle, if you didn't know quantum mechanics, this is supposed to be a complete description. Right? That's the content of Hamiltonian mechanics. When quantum mechanics enters into the mix, you just go from this apparently complete description to a different complete description, which is the Schrodinger equation. So there's some wave function now, which is a function of all the coordinates, and there's some Hamiltonian function that acts on it as an operator, right? And again, the idea is that if you knew your initial conditions, you should be able to evolve these equations. They're all, in both cases, they're linear in time. So given the initial conditions, you just evolve it, and you should know what's happening, even in a very complicated many-particle system. And this is sort of where things are left before you learn about StatMech. And the whole point about statistical mechanics is to realize that although this seems like a complete description, it's actually not a practical description. And even more importantly, at a conceptual level, it lacks something. And what it lacks is any connection with a bunch of statements that we are used to from everyday experience. We are used to the idea of bodies reaching equilibrium. And there's a sort of a zeroth statement we learn in thermodynamics. If A reaches equilibrium with B and A reaches equilibrium with C, then B and C also reach equilibrium. And we know that when you have equilibrium states, and we know what equilibrium means just operationally from empirical experience, we can assign a scalar temperature to them. And we know all these things from starting from that phenomenological description. There is a whole science of thermodynamics, right? So there are, in the science of thermodynamics, in contrast to the science of dynamics, where you have this sort of imaginary microscopic access to all the coordinates and all the momenta, in the science of thermodynamics, you have operational definitions of some key macroscopic objects and some properties. So one is the idea that things reach equilibrium, and equilibrium is not easy to define. It's roughly speaking what happens when all the fast things have happened and all the slow things are going to take too long to happen, right? So then there's a concept of a temperature, and then there's a notion of heat transferred, and the idea that you can convert work to heat, and you can use some heat to do a little bit of work, and these are all things you know from thermodynamics. Now you could ask where do all these things, where do all these words we use in thermodynamics, which have good operational definitions that engineers are happy with, where do all these words sit in that description, right? And that is usually the beginning of any course on statistical theories. And what you are taught is that where all this sits inside that is actually kind of subtle and involves a leap of faith at some level. There's no proof. But the idea is that since the system is so big and dynamics is so complicated, and specifying the initial condition involves so many variables that you don't have access to, it's much better to adopt a more statistical point of view and make statements about statistical weights. And that leads you to science of statistical mechanics, which allows you to make connections to this, right? And the golden formula in that at the end of a class on StatMech will usually start with what I just said, and it will end with this thing. Right? So KB is 1. And then this temperature is supposed to be the same as the temperature that appeared in all our operational definitions of thermodynamics, right? And at this level of description, the conceptual sort of path from there to there using that is the same. And it's just that the trace can have two meanings. So in the quantum way of thinking, this trace is just a sum over all the states of the system. And in classical sort of ways of doing things, you would write it as dp, dq, integral over all the momenta, all the coordinates with some constant c that will allow you, that will have the dimensions of inverse phase space allowing you to count, right? And that's the only difference. And that has important consequences in classical StatMech versus quantum StatMech. And the whole point of this very slow introduction was to make that apparent. If you think like this and you write down something like this, right? Then clearly this part only cares about the momentum, and that part only cares about the coordinate and the two factorize. So in classical StatMech, although in Hamiltonian mechanics, the treatment in classical mechanics parallels the one in quantum mechanics very closely. In both cases, momenta are conjugate to coordinates. You can't specify the time evolution of one without knowing the time evolution of the other. But in this statistical description, you manage to factorize what happens to the momenta from what happens to the coordinates, right? And as a major consequence is the statement that there is no sort of intrinsic notion of dynamics in classical statistics. So if you're doing classical statistical mechanics, you can write this as and of course, by dp and dq, I mean the integral over all variables. You can write this as right, and this part is trivial. It's just equipartition of energy, of kinetic energy, and this is the part that we focus on when we talk of the statistical mechanics of classical model systems, right? And that's why there's no sort of intrinsic notion of dynamics in this case, right? So anytime you discuss any model in classical statistical mechanics, you specify basically a sum over configurations. And if you want to study something dynamics, you have to by hand postulate some dynamics that goes on top of the statement of the problem. This is the statement of the problem. Now, in the quantum world, if you're thinking quantum mechanically, up to this point you've done the same thing. But now you've got trace e to the minus beta h, which is a sum over the exact eigenstates of the system notionally. And now the point is both the p's and the q's are operators in the same Hilbert space in which these eigenstates live. And there is no way in which you can take the sum of two operators in the exponential like that. By the way, let me stop and ask, is this visible to everybody? Okay. So there's no way in the quantum world when you have two operators and you write e to the a plus b like this, you cannot simply say e to the a times e to the b unless the two operators commute. The whole point about momenta and coordinates is that they don't commute, right? So unlike classical statistical mechanics, when you're talking quantum mechanically about the statistical properties of the system in equilibrium, the dynamics is very much a part of your prescription. Okay? So this is the first and most important thing to realize when you're talking of a quantum mechanical system at very low temperature. That the dynamics is intrinsically a part of what you're going to do. And so when we discuss quantum phase transitions, as opposed to classical phase transitions, and I've not yet got to that, I've not yet told you what's a quantum phase transition, but the really interesting thing about quantum phase transitions is the fact that they have dynamical consequences which are measured, for example, in inelastic neutron scattering experiments, in terms of the dynamical properties of objects. Right? So I just wanted to start by emphasizing this very elementary thing, which all of you have seen in a statistical physics course, but maybe not paid too much attention. So this will be central in the ways we think, right? The way we think about everything will now be in the language of Hamiltonian mechanics with statistical input, right? So we will not be able to forget the dynamics. So we'll come to that, but all at this point I want you to notice that there's no way I can talk about a configuration sum and its properties independently of the dynamics. And I'm going to use dynamics and spectrum of the Hamiltonian interchangeably. They are just dual to each other, right? Because we know in quantum mechanics, energy differences correspond to characteristic frequencies of motions. Okay? So that's sort of the first point I want to make. So I think this is kind of dead space, right? Not to write there, right? Yeah. So let me go back there. So in making the transition from classical mechanics or quantum mechanics to statistical descriptions, we had a huge jump. We went from thinking in terms of coordinates and momenta of individual particles, abandoned that totally, and instead came up with a way of thinking statistically where we could make contact with ideas of temperature, of heat, and so on. And these are all properties that don't make sense at the level of one particle or two particles or even 20 particles. There's no particular sense in which you can ask what's the temperature of a 5-particle system. I mean, you could make a definition, but it won't have all the useful and nice properties you expect of temperature in thermodynamics. The same thing is true for things like entropy, which play a central role in our sort of discussion of big objects, right? There's no sense in which you can, no useful sense in which you could define an entropy for a very small collection of particles, for a few body problem, like a nuclear few body problem. Because although you can make the definition, it won't have many of the useful properties that you are familiar with, and that makes these concepts central to the discussion of statistical physics or thermodynamics, right? So there's a huge leap of faith involved in going from here to here, or a huge conceptual development where you introduce new quantities. Now, you could ask the same question about this prescription. So let's say you have this prescription and this is where you start, right? You have this rule that you're given a Hamiltonian for a many-body system, and if you do this, you get a partition function, and then minus kBt log of z is the free energy, and everything is supposed to follow from that golden form, right? So you could say, so I'll replace Newton's laws or a statement of Schrodinger's equation with this formula. Now, you have again a question you have to ask. There are many things we know about how collections of a large number of particles, or how matter condensed to form a liquid or a gas behave. Right? And among the many things we know, I'm going to list a few. And you have to ask, where do all those phenomena sit inside this formula? Right? So, for example, you know, let's write down in no particular order, condensed matter and Mustansir may have gone over some of this in the first lecture, but a little bit of repetition is okay. So we know that condensed matter can exist in multiple phases. So that means the same chemical substance, the same chemical composition can either be a liquid, or it can be a gas, or it can be a solid, right? We know that as you change temperature, or pressure, for example, or in some cases composition, there can be sharply defined changes of phase. This is empirical knowledge we have. We know that some kinds of transitions can be avoided and some cannot. So let me give you an example of what I mean by that. So this is the sort of standard diagram we see in textbooks on statistical physics. Let's use some colors. This is a crystal, this is vapor, this is the liquid phase of the same substance, right? And as far as we know, these yellow lines cannot be avoided. In other words, I don't know how to go by changing the pressure and the temperature from a crystal to either a liquid or a vapor without some sharply defined phase transformation. Okay? But I do know how to go from a liquid to a vapor by sort of going around like this, and this is the famous critical point. Now, just to sort of check people are awake, I drew this going like that. Is that typical? No. Why is it not typical? Sorry? Right. So this is for maybe, okay, and mostly things will look more like that, right? Okay. So carbon dioxide would go like this, water goes like that. Highly exaggerated, of course. So we know from experience that there are certain kinds of phase transformations that you don't seem to be able to avoid, right? Yes. Yeah. That's right. That's right. So we have not yet come that far. We'll come to that. We'll come to that. For simple substances, they were measured very long ago, yes. Right, carbon dioxide, water, they were measured very long ago. In fact, Mustan sir at lunch was telling us the story of how this was measured for, was it carbon dioxide? Yeah, carbon dioxide in the 1860s or something. So this is old knowledge. No, no, no. So one of the things you must realize is you can calculate almost nothing exactly with this formula. Okay, it's I think a true statement. So you know how mathematicians say almost everywhere. So that's in that same way I'm saying almost nothing. Okay? You can't calculate. That's why it's important to talk and think conceptually a little bit before you solve some simple toy models. Okay? All right. So supposing you actually model the interatomic potentials of carbon dioxide and try to stick it into either a quantum or a classical version of that formula, there's very little progress. So the best knowledge we have about things like this will always be empirical. Actually, this is a good place to pause. Are there any other questions about things that were sort of, in my mind, background material? Okay, good. I think so. Yeah, roughly. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, one can get estimates. One can get the structure of the phase diagram. But if you're asking, is it precisely known from a theoretical calculation? I think the answer is no. Of course, computer calculations, you can do some. So now, just like, yeah, yeah, yeah. Sure. This one, right? Yeah, so to the best of our knowledge, this will not end, right? And we will discuss why a little bit later. That's right, that it can do. So the point is, there's something very sort of sharp or qualitatively different about a crystal, which we will discuss now. And that's the reason why we are fairly confident that if you want to go from this to something else, it must go through some abrupt phase change, or not even abrupt, sharply defined. That's the key. Okay? There's no qualitative sort of, it's not a matter of opinion whether you've gone through it or not. It's sharply. So we will come to that. So just like we went from Newtonian mechanics and asked where is temperature, where is entropy hiding in that formula, and arrived at classical statistical mechanics or quantum statistical mechanics, we could ask the question, okay, here's this master formula. Where do all these things hide inside this master, right? And is there another big leap needed conceptually to understand these from that? And the answer, luckily, is no. There's nothing like this kind of a leap needed to do it. But still, new concepts do come about, are needed. So, new concepts enter our discussion when we want to ask where is all this hiding, or where are all these statements hiding in a formula like this, right? So, for much of today's, first part of today's lecture, I want to talk of some of these new ideas, right? They are not dramatically disconnected from that formula the way temperature or entropy is from Newtonian mechanics, but they do involve some new ingredients. So it's worth going through. Okay? So let's do that now. Actually, since there was a question and you're here, do you want to give the name of the person, the reference for this carbon dioxide? covers the first two things I wanted to say. So the first new idea or concept that plays a role in our thinking is somebody whispered it out there. Okay. So let's start with that phase diagram which I raised and focus on the crystal. Right? Presumably that the microscopic Hamiltonian of the atoms that make up that crystal have some Hamiltonian, which I could write like this. Okay. And this Hamiltonian has an obvious symmetry, right? This is after all non-relativistic quantum mechanics. And it's the symmetry of arbitrary translations. As long as you translate all the coordinates together, nothing changes. Right? So there's this translation symmetry. That leaves the Hamiltonian in here, right? But what's the defining property of a crystal? The density is modulated, right? And that's what you mean by having a crystal. There's a periodic arrangement of atoms. The density is modulated. And so you could sort of do a small formal calculation. Let's define the density at a point x to be just sum over all the j just counts how many particles there are at that point in space, right? And what we know about a crystal, let's say from X-ray scattering, the fact that you see black spots says that there is some periodic grating. That means this is a periodic function. It's not a smooth, constant function. I mean, it's smooth, but it's not constant, right? So you get rho of x observed is modulated. Right? So this, of course, violates apparently this symmetry, because this symmetry rule says that any change of all the particle coordinates by the same amount should not change anything. And if nothing should change, then the coarse grained density that's measured should also not change. So we would have expected rho of x observed is equal to rho observed x plus any change, any eta. Okay? But that's clearly not what happens in a crystal. We know that empirically. So when you start thinking about how that's possible, you start learning a few things. So let's do that. So first of all, let's give a sort of a fake proof or a misleading proof that a crystal is impossible, starting with that formula. Okay? So let's do that here. So let's define the symmetry of translations to be implemented by some operator acting on the Hilbert space. So this operator is the operator that takes every r and sends it to Ri plus some number eta, which is constant, right? And T eta h, T eta inverse is the same as h. That's simply the statement that the Hamiltonian is invariant under this transformation. Okay? So now let's ask what is rho x plus eta. write it here. By definition. And then we'll remember that these averages simply mean you have to compute the trace of e to the minus beta h t rho at x t inverse, right? This is the formula that should tell us what is the density at x plus eta. Okay? So let me put a subscript eta. So we translate by eta. But now we use the fact that the Hamiltonian is invariant. We use this. Okay? So I can move this operator there. Right? So I can write this and now all traces are cyclic. So this can go there and cancel. And I have formally proved to you that rho of x plus eta must equal rho of x. Right? So our master formula appears to be inconsistent with the empirical observation that sometimes condensed matter forms spontaneously into periodic arrangements we call a crystal. Right? So something has to give. So let's now examine what gives, what goes wrong. Okay? So you have this name down, right? Well, it can stay. Let's go there. So why do you see sort of bragg spots when you pass X-rays through a crystal? Because the density of matter varies periodically with a definite periodicity. So it's like a grating formed by that matter. And so that gives two characteristics. Modulated means goes up and goes down, right? Okay, yeah, sorry, yeah. Sorry? Yes. 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 So that's the statement that the Hamiltonian is invariant. Right? Well, we just proved it. Right? So you will see exactly what the problem is. Just give me 1 minute. So where did that formula come from? Right? This trace e to the minus beta h. It came from assuming that, roughly speaking, your system is able to explore all the phase space available to it. Right? That in the window of time over which experiments are done, in some sense, the system has explored all the phase space available to it, and it's exploring it with a certain statistical weight. Right? These are the words we use when we describe the statistical approach to calculating anything. Right? So the key point is, in the window of observation for the experiment or on experimental time scales, you want the system to have explored all the phase space available to it, and in that case you can write down this trace e to the minus beta h. Right? That's where it came from. So if that formula is predicting there can't be a crystal, then obviously some assumption that goes into the formula must be breaking. Right? And the assumption that likely breaks down, or we know with hindsight breaks down, and you'll see how, is this assumption that the system can explore all available states. Right? In quantum language, the statement is whether the system is likely to be in all eigenstates with that weight. And you will see that there's sort of groupings in the space of eigenstates, so that a system initially in some state or in a wave packet made up of some states can't easily go to the other side. So what gives is this idea that things are ergodic, or ergodic may be a strong word, that this statistical assumption is correct. Right? So that breaks down. That's why the formula doesn't give the right answer. And it breaks down in an interesting way that teaches you something. So let's go through now some of the aspects of symmetry. So first is something I already said. None of these I'm able to prove, but I'm just sort of saying a bunch of things that at the end of 10 minutes you will see all fit in and are all internally consistent. And that, I think, is the best anybody can do, except in simple models like the one we'll take tomorrow, where these things will become absolutely precise in calculation. So I'm going to put ergodicity in quotes because I'm not even sure I want to use exactly that term, in its technical sense. But in the sense I just described, there must be some loss of ergodicity involved in spontaneous symmetry. And roughly speaking, imagine you had a crystal in which, so these are supposed to be tracks of some individual atom. The tracks all lie in some small bubble. So that's my crystal, right? So that's why the density is modulated. I'm just imagining a classical picture where atoms move around but always in little cages, and the cages are always nicely periodically arranged. That's the picture. That's the dynamical picture, let's say, of a crystal. Not a good one, but let's just draw that. Somehow it must be that if you start with this, it's not easy on experimental time scales for the system to go there. So this is the original set of trajectories. And it's not easy for the crystal to go to a configuration where this atom is now moving here, this atom is now moving here, this one's moving there, this one's moving there, and these are all the same. This is what I mean by some kind of loss of atoms. Okay? This I'm just saying because the formula failed. Okay? I'm just drawing your attention to the fact that if you have a crystal, something interesting is happening dynamically, or must be happening dynamically. That's the first statement. The second, so let's go here, that's the first. Crystal is a rigid body. I'm just saying this in the colloquial sense of the word, right? It's rigid in a sense in which a liquid is not rigid, or so a gas is certainly not. Crystal is rigid. I'm just apparently making an everyday observation, but you will see it actually connects to this. Okay? And what I mean by rigid, roughly speaking, is if I push on the atoms at the left end of the crystal, and they are forced to move a little bit, then that constrains more or less atoms at the other end to move the same distance. Right? So it transmits forces. Right? That's what we mean by rigid. So now let's try and think intuitively and see how this fact that a crystal is rigid could help us understand this. help us understand why that formula failed. So let's for a moment think very macroscopically. I've got a rigid uh, solid, a crystal, it's a bar in my hand, right? I don't worry too much about what's happening inside. Those details are not of that much interest to me for the moment. As a rigid body, I know that it has a center of mass degree of freedom that's well defined and that's very well decoupled from the rest of the system, right? And I know what's the Hamiltonian for the center of mass of a rigid body, right? So the Hamiltonian for the center of mass of a rigid body, so is simply the momentum square of the center of mass of that rigid body divided by 2 times the total mass of that body, right? This is actually falling back to undergraduate physics now. For the moment, I'm giving up on trying to understand why X-rays diffract through a crystal and not through a liquid in a particular way. And I'm just saying if I have a rigid body, certainly there's a center of mass degree of freedom which is well decoupled from the rest, and that has this Hamiltonian, right? And the interesting point to note is an obvious one. This is the total mass of the crystal. That means if you have a macroscopic object, this is huge, right? So this M total is Avogadro's number into the mass of an atom, right? So it's very, very big. Okay. So if that's the Hamiltonian, we know what the eigenstates are. They're plane waves labeled by the center of mass momentum P, right? And they have energies P square over 2m total, right? Now there's a reason why when I look at that duster or cricket ball in my hand, I don't need to think about quantum mechanics and wave particle duality and so on and so forth, right? There's a reason why classical mechanics works when the mass is that big. And we all know the reason. The reason is that the energy levels of this Hamiltonian are so closely spaced, right, that it's very, very easy for us to make a wave packet that localizes that object in some definite location in space, right? That then corresponds to our everyday experience that classical objects have a well-defined location and a velocity, right? So that's again very elementary undergraduate physics. So let's just write that down though, okay? So we have very sort of closely spaced energy levels. The spacing is 1 over volume, right? Because M total grows with volume, right? So, and notice that the variable conjugate to this is just the rigid translations of the crystal as a whole, right? So now, let's ask ourselves, can I make a wave packet where this is a good picture, right? And if I make that wave packet where this is a good picture, on what time scale will it fall apart and start having significant overlap with that picture where everything is moved by eta, right? To estimate that, let's say you want to localize things within some length scale delta. So the spread in momenta you will need to use to localize it is 1 over delta. My h bar is being set to 1, okay? But the spread in energy that this implies, because of the way that formula looks, because of the fact that these levels are so closely spaced, is actually very small. So change in energy that this implies, or the different energies that you have to combine to make this wave packet, is just right. So the time scale over which this wave packet is a good description is the inverse of this, with h bar being 1. time scale right, and this is just some small number but finite, non-zero. Right? Now, in the thermodynamic limit, which is the only limit in which phase transitions are sharply defined and crystals are a sharply defined different phase from a liquid, this time scale is divergent. Right? So, you see this broken ergodicity that we talked about is connected with the fact that a crystal is rigid and is connected with this particular structure. Let's call this the third property. Yeah. Delta is just the accuracy over which I want to specify the position of the crystal as a whole. It's just some small, it's the resolution of your experimental parameters. But the point about it is it's a non-zero number. So as long as it's a non-zero number, this time scale is always going to diverge in the thermodynamic limit. So what we have said is that the standard statistical prescription, trace e to the minus beta h, is inconsistent with the existence of a crystal in that formal sense. Then we have said, oh, that must be because the system can't, if it starts from this kind of configuration, the one on the left, go to the other one, which is slightly rigidly located. Then we have sort of also thought that, well, crystals are rigid bodies. There's a certain notion of rigidity. And because of that notion of rigidity, the center of mass degree of freedom is nicely decoupled from the rest and has a spectrum that's very, very sort of tightly spaced. It's collapsing. Right? So that's the third point we made. And then the fourth point is we went back to that ergodicity thing and we said, look, if that's the case, I can make wave packets, just like we learn about semi-classics in quantum mechanics, that can last for arbitrary amounts of time without exploring the other part of the phase space. And that is the sense in which ergodicity is broken. And that's why that formula we used is too naive. Okay? So this idea, so this set of concepts or these observations all make up this idea of spontaneous symmetry. So the underlying system, the Hamiltonian, the dynamics, has some symmetry. Right? But the low temperature state of the system, the thermodynamic phase you're in, breaks that symmetry in the sense that observables that you measure do not have that symmetry anymore. And that's formally disallowed by the prescription of statistical mechanics. But you understand why, and it's a sort of a simple reason. It's that ergodicity in this particular sense is broken. And in the quantum world, that corresponds to a spectrum of states that collapses like this. Of course, there are other states. In my idealized way of thinking, they are very far up compared to this 1 over volume. So there's some set of states that collapses to zero in the thermodynamic. And wave packets made from that set of states live for a very long time in a symmetry broken state. Okay. So this is sort of the set of ideas that underpins spontaneous symmetry breaking. Let's continue. There's a few more things I want to say about spontaneous symmetry breaking. So let's do it here. Now, specific to the kind of symmetry that's broken in a crystal, which is a continuous symmetry, it's a symmetry of translations by any arbitrarily real number, right? Arbitrary real vector. It's not a discrete symmetry, right? Specific to that kind of symmetry breaking, there's another observation we could make. And that's a very simple one. If this is a good pattern in the sense that thermodynamics favors this arrangement of atoms, then anything displaced rigidly is of course the same, and that's what we've said. But now imagine you don't displace rigidly. Let's say you displace this layer by eta 1, this layer by eta 1 plus a little bit, right? And then this layer by eta 1 plus a little bit more. And so that over a very long spacing, after many, many layers, you have changed the displacement. And then you bring it back to what it was. Clearly, a configuration like this, or this kind of distortion, will not cost much energy, because it's almost the same as a rigid translation. And almost the same as having, it's almost the same as a rigid translation. So doing this will cost an energy that's really low. In the limit of a rigid translation, it would cost energies like this, 1 over volume. These are the states. This is the collapsing tower of states. But now you're not doing it exactly rigidly, but you can see that since you're going to take the limit where this is happening very slowly, right, the energy will still go to 0, right? Now this is distinct from the rigid translation, right? It's connected with the fact that the system is rigid. It's only because the fact that the system is rigid and because its symmetry is broken that you're even allowed to talk about some slow modulation. Because slow modulation about what? You need a reference. You need a rigid reference to define slow modulations. That's available if symmetry is spontaneously broken and there's rigidity. And then you can say that slow modulations will also have energy that goes to 0 as the wavelength of the modulation goes to infinity. Okay? So formally you would say that there must be some modes, some eigenmodes, so there must be some energy eigenvalues labeled by a momentum that go to 0 as the momentum goes to 0, wave number goes to 0. Okay? So this is the inverse wavelength. And those of you who have learned a little bit of particle physics, you would have heard of Goldstone bosons in field theory or in particle physics that arise whenever symmetry is spontaneously broken in field theories. That's exactly this statement. And in more pedestrian terms, these are the acoustic phonons of any crystal. Okay? In solid state, you must have done a class where you work out phonons in some Einstein model and then you do a bit better. Then you arrive at acoustic phonons where this does happen. In the case of acoustic phonons, 0 linearly. So epsilon of q equals c times 1. Right? That can change depending on the system you're looking at, but it must go to 0 as q goes to 0. Now let's put this back in to that picture of the spectrum. So you have this collapsing tower of states all in a window which is 1 over volume. And in my initial pass through this description, I said, oh, the other states are very high up. You realize now that if the symmetry that's spontaneously broken is a continuous one, there are necessarily these Goldstone boson excitations or spin waves or phonons, acoustic phonons, that must come to 0. And in the case of a solid, for example, they come to 0 as 1 over, they come to 0 as q. Now what's the smallest wave number you can make in a finite system of size L? It's order 1 over N. So there's actually, it's no good saying that the other states are very far away. They are also coming to 0, but not as 1 over volume. They are coming to 0 as 1 over N. So this is the acoustic phonon branch of the spectrum. This is the collapsing tower of states, collapsing as 1 over volume. That is a signal of spontaneous symmetry break. Right? So this is how far we've got just by sort of talking. So let's see how much further we can get. So there's a couple more things I wanted to say. This one is collapsing much faster than that. So there's a qualitative distinction between them. Right, that's a very good question. let's come to that. Let's come to that. So it's a fact that crystals can't exist even at zero temperature in one dimension. They can exist at zero temperature in two dimensions, but not at finite, not at non-zero. We'll come to that. Or maybe Mustansir will. You're going to do Costellus Thouless? It's there. Okay. I may mention it briefly. Yeah. 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 So some small refinement is now possible in the case where the symmetry that's broken is continuous, which is to say there's another branch of excitations that comes down, but not as one. All right. So what else did I want to say? Let's see. Oh, and then this brings me back to so the distinction between a crystal and a liquid, as we've just seen by talking about exactly what happens in a crystal, is a qualitative one. It's an unavoidable one in the sense that it's not a matter of numbers. It's not whether it's 0.1 or 0.2. Either there is symmetry or there is not, right? And in a crystal, there is not, right? So that's a yes-no question. And anytime you can distinguish two phases by yes-no questions, or the answers to yes-no questions, the transition between them is unavoidable. There will be no path in phase space that you can go smoothly from one to the other. Okay? So that's why one of those yellow lines in that figure we drew of the standard phase diagram of a liquid gas crystal, one of those yellow lines is not expected to just end in nothing. As Mustansir said, it can join other lines, but it cannot end in nothing, because if it ended in nothing, you would have opened for you a smooth path that would take you from a crystal to a fluid. We already know that liquids and gases you can connect smoothly. So let's call the two of them together fluids. So you would get a smooth path from a crystal to a fluid, and we've just argued that that's not possible. Let's see, there's one or two more things I wanted to say. Yes. This goes back to what I wrote here actually. This goes back to the fact that the cricket ball does not need quantum mechanics to describe it. Its coordinate and its momentum can be thought of as classical. Right? And in the case of the crystal, the center of mass motion is like that, semi-classical. So whenever a symmetry is broken, there is always some very heavy variable that emerges. In this case, it's just the rigid translation and the center of mass motion. Right? In other cases, we'll explicitly see what here. By heavy, I simply mean something where commutation relations no longer matter and you can start thinking semi-classical. Right? In this case, literally heavy. Right? So there's some heavy semi-classical variable that emerges, which you can usually identify with the order parameter. So I haven't yet said what's an order parameter. So semi-classical dynamics of order parameter. I haven't formally defined one, but this is the variable that we introduce to keep track of the different symmetry related possibilities between which the system chooses when it spontaneously breaks a symmetry. Right? So in this case, you would say that the different symmetry related possibilities are just the location of the center of mass of the rigid crystal as a whole, this eta variable. Right? But it's a little trickier than that, because once you have a periodic modulation, if you change the center of mass by exactly one period, it's the same system again. So it's not really a real number, it's more like a phase, it's periodic. You come back to the original state after going a certain number. So it's this made periodic. That's the order parameter for a crystal. More formally, you would just define the Fourier transform of the density. So you would define sum over all the r. In continuous language, you would just do integral dr e to the I q dot r rho of r. Call this rho of q. Right? This is just the Fourier transform of the density, the observed density. Yeah. Yeah, so far we are just focusing on the breaking of the translations. We can discuss the consequences of it. Right now we are just talking of this much. Because that takes us further afield. Let's not go there in the first place. Okay? So we have the Fourier transform, and we know from our standard X-ray diffraction theory that this has very huge peaks at certain wavelengths, which are the reciprocal lattice vectors. So the actual, I said the order parameter is like an angle in the case of a crystal. So there's some phase variable. That phase is actually just the phase of this complex. There are three phases because you need three G's to specify the crystal. Each of them has a phase, and that's really the order parameter of this. So it's unfortunately this example is elementary in some ways and less familiar in others. We'll see other examples of order parameters which will connect more closely with the order parameters you define in simple modular statistical mechanics. So I think that covers what I wanted to say about symmetry breaking. Oh, there's one last point, which is an obvious one. Anytime a symmetry is spontaneously broken, along with rigidity, there's also long-range correlations. Because the reason something is rigid, after all, is that things like to be in registry with each other. So if you move the first atom, the last atom wants to move exactly the same amount, which means that there's correlations between the first and the last atom, which means there's long-range correlations. So rigidity goes hand in hand with long-range correlations, right? So there's always long-range correlations. Sorry, my board work got a bit disorganized. This should be 8. Right? So there's some local variable which you can look at, whose correlations are long range, and that's connected with the order parameter. Yeah. Right. So you can imagine doing sort of some coarse graining of the density in some little region and look at its Fourier modes and ask how they relate. Is the phase here locked to the phase there? Right? If the phases are in registry of the two Fourier transforms you do locally, then the whole thing is a periodic pattern. Otherwise, it's not. It's the same thing. We'll come to it. Yeah. So, for example, if I read this whole discussion not for a crystal, but for a magnet. So, I would say, oh, I have some system where the spins can point anywhere in spin space, and the Hamiltonian is invariant under rotations in spin space, right? But in the low temperature state, all the spins are pointing in one direction. How is that possible? And I could go through exactly this set of arguments for that system. I would again formally conclude it's impossible, but then I would again learn that actually there is some breaking of ergodicity that makes it possible. In that case, the heavy variable is actually the collective motion of all the spins together. So it's the net angular momentum variable that plays the role of the net center of mass variable. And the role of total mass is played by the total susceptance of the magnet, the moment of inertia of the rotor. So we could have done the same discussion in that language. In fact, this is a good point to make. The first time all these things were said together as a coherent whole, I think, is in a paper by Anderson on quantum antiferromagnets. In 1950, I think it's a PhysRev 1950. I think it says theory of the antiferromagnetic ground state. So in fact, there the example given was of a magnet, but not a ferromagnet, an antiferromagnet. We'll come to it. So I think that's sort of my first very extended point. So this is an example of the new ideas you need when you want to start asking where do the phenomena you know from experiment, where do they sit in the prescription trace e to the minus beta. Okay? So just this one phenomena that things can crystallize leads us to all these. All right. So now let's go to some more things along these lines. Wait here. I have 20 minutes. Very good. So different phases. So now we are sort of thinking of all the ways in which different phases can be sharply distinguished. So one is just spontaneous symmetry break. Okay? And then there must unavoidably be a sharp distinction hiding in that formula trace e to the minus beta. Another way there can be a sharp distinction is different phases have quasi-particles with different quantum numbers. So I've sort of said too much in one sentence, so let's back off a little. So first of all, any phase of matter is usually characterized by some energetic tendency winning over some other energetic tendency. So the potential energy wins over the kinetic energy, or some particular term in the potential energy wins over other terms. You get some well-defined phase where the behavior is dictated by one dominant tendency. In such situations, there is usually sort of very well-defined particle-like excitations above the many-body ground state. And what do I mean by particle-like or quasi-particle excitations? You have to always think in terms of some sort of operational definition. And the definition here would be that you imagine doing some scattering experiment where you have a scattering probe that hits your sample, let's say a beam of neutrons, which have their own magnetic moment, and then they get deflected. And in the process, they deposit an energy h bar omega, a momentum q, and a spin angular momentum m along the z-axis into the sample. So they've got deflected, they've deposited this. Okay? So let's say m, delta m is plus 1. That corresponds to the case of spin flip scattering of neutrons. Okay? You've deposited that energy and that moment. Now you do this experiment and just make a histogram of your counts. This is the rate versus omega at fixed q. Okay? So sometimes you see a very sharp peak, instrument limited. That means energy only goes in certain quanta that are controlled by the momentum. You change this momentum, the peak shifts. So you can plot the dispersion relation omega of q or epsilon of q, which is the position of the peak as a function of position of the peak on the x-axis as a function of q. And this is what we mean by a particle. Right? We would now say that in this phase of matter, whatever it is inside this box, there's some many-body ground state, and excitations above it are particles that carry quantum number 1 of this magnetic quantum number and have a definite energy momentum relation. Right? So you would say there are spin 1 quasi-particles in this material or in this phase of this material. Right? In contrast, if you get something like this, same experiment, you're counting the rate versus omega, you get something like that. Okay? Just some broad feature with some threshold. you would say that there is no quasi-particle in this situation that has that quantum number. The actual quasi-particle excitations or elementary particle-like excitations of the many-body ground state carry some other quantum numbers, and maybe two of them have to combine to absorb that one, that delta m of 1, and that leads to this characteristic width or broad feature, because now there's no fixed relationship between omega and q. Those two particles can take up a different proportion of the energy and you can get a continuum, right? So this would be signature that there are no spin 1 quasi-particles in the magnet. This would be a signature there are. So in this well-defined sense, if the different phases you're talking about have quasi-particles with different quantum numbers, then again it's not easy to imagine how you can have a path in parameter space that smoothly goes from one to the other. Because quantum numbers don't change smoothly. Either you have, yeah. So very good. So let's come to that. So that's the next point I want to make. So different phases. So let's first talk about phases. But just to give you a quick sort of summary answer, phase transitions in the quantum world, so ground state, changes of the ground state, changes in the nature of the ground state, are places where neither the quasi-particles of one phase nor the quasi-particles of the other phase are well defined. Right? Both descriptions become strongly interacting, and the real description is in terms of some strongly fluctuating fluid. There is no well-defined notion of quasi-particles. That's what characterizes the quantum. So I've not yet said what that is, but so these particle ideas only work deep in phases. As you get closer and closer to a critical point, in some sense these particles dissolve into some critical fluid. That's the picture we have. They get more and more complicated dressings of virtual excitations around them, and we'll do a simple calculation tomorrow where we'll put some formulae that back up these words. Okay? All right. There's even more dramatic ways in which different phases can be sharply distinguished. Different quantum phases can be sharply distinguished. And by the way, let me at this point just say that everything I'm saying applies at low temperature. Low enough temperature where I need to start remembering that quantum mechanics plays a role in the ultimate description of matter. So what I have in mind is I have some Hamiltonian that describes the system, and maybe there's two different terms in it that have very different behavior or energetic preferences, and let's say lambda is their ratio. As a function of lambda, there's a sharp distinction in the nature of the ground state. For example, the nature of the quasi-particles might change, or the phases could be distinguished by presence or absence of a symmetry, right? So this point is what I would call a quantum phase transition. And it's nothing very different from a classical phase transition. In fact, if these phases can survive thermal fluctuations, growing out of this will be a thermal phase transition. Thermal and quantum simply refers to what you're going to tune to drive the transition. So more generally, there is just some line of transition, right? This is, let's say, the transition you're used to thinking about, but you could equally well imagining changing some terms in the Hamiltonian and drive it like that. And then you could drive the same thing like that or like that. And in the limit of temperature going to 0, there's still a change in the ground state, and that's the quantum, right? But what I'm talking about there doesn't just apply here. It actually applies at low temperature everywhere. Because once you're at low enough temperature, you must remember that the world is quantum mechanical, right? So then descriptions of the type I'm giving you become more and more appropriate. So there's a couple more ways in which you can sharply distinguish phases. You can even have mutual statistics of particles. So just like fermions pick up a minus sign when you exchange them, two different particles, when you take one all around the other, can have phase factors in two dimensions. So different phases can be distinguished by different patterns of mutual statistics. That's kind of outside the sort of subject of this course. We'll sort of at the most see an example of this. And let me now just elaborate one final point, which is just this picture. If the ground state is going to change character qualitatively, so that on one side you're in one phase, which is qualitatively distinct from the other phase, then in the energy diagram of the system, two levels must cross. Right? Because if you're in the same energy eigenfunction and no other energy eigenfunction comes near it and crosses it, then the properties of that eigenfunction are going to be smoothly varying with parameters in the Hamiltonian. So this is some parameter in the Hamiltonian. Right? You cannot have a qualitative distinction in behavior of the type that you expect here. Right? So two levels must cross. They could cross like this, one just sails through the other, or they could cross in a more generic way, which is a avoided level crossing. Right? When do you expect this to happen? Take a matrix, take a 2 by 2 matrix. When do two eigenvalues just cross? When there's no mixing element between the two sectors. Right? In the 2 by 2 case, if there's no off-diagonal term at all, the two eigenvalues just cross. Right? When are there no mixing terms or off-diagonal terms between different parts of a Hilbert space? When they are distinguished by symmetry. So for example, if this level carries some quantum number, which is different from some quantum number of that level, then they belong to different block diagonal sectors of the Hamiltonian, and they don't know about each other as matrices. Right? So this one is one of the eigenvalues of one block, and this is one of the eigenvalues of some other block. They can sail through each other. But if two eigenvalues belong to the same block, right, which means they have the same quantum numbers, then generically, just from this 2 by 2 example, just take this example of H minus H delta delta. Right? Without delta, the levels just cross at H equal to 0. Right? The vector 1, 0 and the vector 0, 1 are the two eigenvectors when delta is 0, and one of them is lower than the other, and then when H changes sign, it flips. They just cross. That's a picture like this. But generically, there's always some off-diagonal elements, and generically, the levels at best have an avoided level. So, at a quantum phase transition, you expect some sort of avoided level crossing. Generically. If it's a level crossing of this type, then usually you can describe the transition with an order parameter that's also a conserved quantity. Because some quantum numbers change. So you could just take that as your order parameter. What are quantum numbers? Quantum numbers are eigenvalues of operators that are conserved, that commute with the Hamiltonian. Right? So take that operator. You can use that as the order parameter because it's going from one quantum number to another. Right? So these kinds of level crossings, we'll see an example. So for example, the transition where of a ferromagnet, right? It has a conserved order parameter because the net moment is also a conserved quantity. If you have a rotationally symmetric Hamiltonian, right? And the net moment is the order parameter. So if you have a conserved order parameter, a quantum phase transition would correspond to a level crossing like this. In more generic cases, it would be an avoided level crossing. And you would say, well, this is going to remain smoothly connected no matter what. Well, the point is this gap will vanish as the thermodynamic limit is approached, which is the same statement as saying there's no sharp distinction between the two phases unless you're in the thermodynamic limit. That is consistent with this picture. We're going to do a simple calculation where all this works, and that will be in the transverse field Ising model, which I hope to get to tomorrow. So I think that kind of covers all the general things I wanted to mention, except one, which is why do I care about the limit of a classical transition at zero temperature? Yeah. Right. So imagine you have the ground state of a many-body system. And let's say the next eigenstate is this one. I'm plotting the energy as a function of some parameter. Right? Of eigenvalue. If this level doesn't come anywhere near this, how can the qualitative properties of this wave function change? You can make actually rigorous continuity arguments that say nothing abrupt can happen as you follow this curve. To the properties, or rather to the expectation values of physical operators taken in this eigenfunction, nothing abrupt can happen. There can be no qualitative change at one place. Right? The only way you can have a qualitative change is if this level went above that level and that level came down, which is like almost trivial case, where the ground state property just says, instead of being the property of Q prime, it's now the property of Q. Right? So there's an abrupt change. And that's the case when the order parameter is conserved. The only way levels will sail through each other is when they belong to different quantum numbers of a conserved quantity. Right? And then that conserved quantity can be used as the order parameter. The more generic example is this. And generically, there'll always be some matrix elements that will prevent the thing from touching. And so you would say it's still continuous. The properties don't change abruptly. But this gap can collapse as the thermodynamic limit is approached. And this collapse of this gap is connected with the fact that there is a genuine phase transition or a genuine singularity or a genuinely qualitatively different behavior only in the thermodynamics. Right? So that's sort of the circle of ideas. Okay, did I want to say anything more? Yeah, one last thing is, why should I care, as I was saying, about some limiting behavior of a classical phase transition? I have 5 lectures on that point. Right? And the answer is actually again one of energy scales and temperature scales. So let's erase this phase boundary for the time being. Let's not call this temperature. So we agreed that a quantum phase transition corresponds to a level crossing or an avoided level crossing. So on both sides there'll be some gap between the ground, many-body ground state and the excited state. Right? So now I'm graphing the gaps. So this is a graph. Here I have delta plus, here I have delta minus. 2 y-axes, 1 x-axis. Okay. So in yellow, let's draw delta plus, which comes down like that. And in green, let's draw delta minus, that also comes down. Right? So there's a gap that collapses coming from both sides. This functional form can be different, you're on 2 different sides. But there's a gap that collapses. Now imagine a system at temperature T bigger than the gaps, whichever one, right? Supposing I'm here, right? At this value of lambda. The gap is delta minus of 1, right? Let's say temperature is much bigger than delta minus of 1, that number, right? So now you imagine what's going to happen. As far as the system is concerned, this regime, where the temperature is much bigger than the gap, is not very different, or is rather continuously connected to the regime where the gap has collapsed and the temperature is small. Right? Which is to say, now if I put temperature here, right? So now it's again my conventional phase diagram. Here I'm just marking the place, the values of the gaps. And this is temperature. There is this whole region up to some upper cutoff, right? Whose properties are going to qualitatively be the same as the properties of a small temperature directly above the quantum. Right? So if I know what happens at small temperatures above the quantum critical point, I actually have an understanding, at least at a qualitative level, sometimes better than that, of the behavior in this whole regime. This regime is characterized by the temperature being the largest energy scale in the problem, bigger than both the gaps. Right? If I go here, this gap becomes bigger than the temperature, and then the system realizes, oops, I'm ordered. If I go there, this gap becomes bigger than the temperature, and the system realizes, oh, I'm a paramagnet, or whichever other phase. Yeah. Well, but small, this is the point. Exactly. So, of course, it's not much use saying by knowing something about this, you can't say by knowing something about this point, I'll predict something here. But certainly I can make predictions here. This is an exaggerated physics, right? There's always some upper cutoff at which all sorts of other physics comes in. But there's a whole regime here, not one point, which is controlled by the effect of temperature on a quantum critical point. And that's why it's interesting to study quantum critical points, because they predict measurable finite temperature properties in an interesting window. And if you think about it, this is the window in which you have excited an enormous number of quasi-particles of this type. If you want to think like this, if you're here, right? In the ground state, there's no particles. Then there are some quasi-particle excitations with some energy gap delta. But if you're here, you have excited a huge number of them, and they make some strongly interacting fluid, right? And in fact, they interact so strongly usually that you can no longer think in terms of those particles. And that's only appropriate because this is, of course, continuously connected with that. And here I would want to start with those quasi-particles. And so this is the region in which I can neither think in terms of these quasi-particles nor in terms of those quasi-particles. And there's just some strongly fluctuating fluid, right, which controls finite temperature properties in this whole region. And the properties of that fluid are a characteristic and universal property of that quantum critical point, in the same sense as I think in the lecture in the morning, he explained to you ideas of universal scale. Right? So we can write down some answers here which are universal. So that's sort of why you study quantum physics in their own right. Yeah. That's right. So that depends on what, I've just drawn some vaguely defined upper cutoff here. That depends on where that comes. By the way, there is a Ginzburg criterion region even here. So let's say, now let's mix up pictures again. Let's not draw gaps. Let's draw the phase diagram. Let's say there's an ordered phase, paramagnet. So symmetry broken, not broken, sharp distinction. And this is the quantum phase transition. Of course, there's a thermal classical phase transition if you're in high enough frequency. And of course, it has its own Ginzburg criteria region like that. Right? So there's some delicate crossovers in this vicinity. Depending on whether you're closer to this point or to the yellow line, you will see classical critical phenomena or quantum critical. Right? We'll come to examples. This is supposed to just be an overview. So I think I've run out of time, and actually I had thought I would have half an hour to introduce the language of second quantization. So maybe tomorrow morning we'll just start with that and then do the transverse realization.